2.5 Admins, episode 224. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, a couple of plugs. ZFS Ask Me Anything on December 12th.
Yep. So this is Clara's next webinar. That'll be 1 p.m. Eastern on December 12th. Click on the link in the show note there to see in your time zone. But that's myself and Mark Maybe, who's been a longtime developer of ZFS and done a lot of interesting things like D-RAID and so on. And we're going to be moderated by Jim as we take your questions on anything you want to ask about ZFS, whether it be how ZFS was originally built and a lot of history, or where it's going next, or just all your burning questions about ZFS.
I look forward to cutting Alan's mic randomly just for the lulz.
All right, and an article, applying the ARC algorithm to the ARC.
Yeah, so this is a new feature that will be part of the next release of ZFS, where ZFS has the ARC algorithm that automatically adjusts between the most recently used and most frequently used part of the cache to find the right balance that gives you the best performance. But with older ZFS, you still had to manually tune the mix between data and metadata. But Alexander Moten made this patch, and now ZFS will actually use the same algorithm to decide which one is benefiting you more, having more metadata or having more data in the cache. And so it will actually, on multiple dimensions, apply that ARC algorithm to adapt to your current workload and give you a cache that's giving you the best possible results.
And the metrics it generates are technically metadata.
Right, well, links to both those in the show notes. Let's do some news. Pat Gelsinger has retired from Intel, not even 4 years into the job. All I can think about is Intel sitting there at the table, flames all around them saying, this is fine.
Whereas all I can think of is the meme where suggestions come from around the table and then the sensible suggestion gets made by somebody and the CEO stands up super mad. And the next frame, you just see them flying out of the window of the skyscraper, falling to their death. So at the heart of this, Intel has failed massively in the foundry side of their business, and it's crippled essentially every aspect. One of the big things that Intel used to set themselves apart from competitors like AMD and NVIDIA is they fabbed their own chips. But to fab your own chips, you need to have a functional foundry, and it needs to be able to compete with all the other foundries. And Intel has not been able to effectively compete with TSMC, the big foundry that does the majority of the chip fabbing for AMD and many other companies. They just have not been able to compete very well for years. And Gelsinger was banking on being able to reverse that trend within 4 years. And, well, he banked wrong. And so now he got chucked out that skyscraper window, and he's waiting to hit at the bottom, I suppose. One of the reasons that it was so important for Intel to do their own foundry work and not simply outsource to somebody else to get it fabbed is that Intel is the American way to fab chips. If you're fabbing chips from TSMC, you are necessarily going to be leaving U.S. borders. So this gave Intel a huge inroad into massive sales in basically rah-rah go Team USA organizations, beginning but certainly not ending with the U.S. government themselves. It's seen as a huge security benefit to say, hey, the pedigree of this part that all of our critical nation-state security data goes through, none of this ever left the country. It's an entirely American-made product. But again, if you can't actually build the foundries to successfully compete, you wind up losing market share, which is exactly what has been happening to Intel. Gelsinger was banking on being able to reverse that trend not only through revamping the work being done on the foundries and getting the foundries built, allocating a lot more of Intel's money towards getting them built in a hurry. He was also trying to accelerate the development cycle. Intel, for a very long time, has been doing what they call a tick-tock development cycle, where the die only shrinks on every other advance. So you have basically sort of an efficiency change that gives you a somewhat higher processor without shrinking the die size. And then on the next generation, you shrink the die size, and shrinking the die size is your main focus, not the other side of building a new chip. And what Gelsinger said is instead of doing a tick-tock and every other year we'll shrink a die size, he said, you know what? We're just going to tick, 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 and we're going to do 5 die shrinks over the next 4 years. And that did not go as planned.
Yeah, quality assurance issues and just fallout from the problems and being faced with almost a possible recall and so on really put things in a bad shape. And then suddenly Intel's looking at losing money for the first time in a really, really long time.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for my 13900K to fry itself.
Yeah. And then, if you're trying to advance things and go with this tick, 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 tick mechanism and so on, laying off 15,000 people and destroying morale while having round after round of layoffs and so on doesn't leave your team in a very good place to be able to actually accomplish these feats of engineering mastery.
I think that the speed of turning things around that Gelsinger was promising was, it probably wasn't ever really something anybody should have banked on. It doesn't sound sustainable or reasonable to me. It sounds like a Hail Mary and, huge promises. The question is, could Gelsinger even have gotten to the top spot if he wasn't promising something that radical? Because Intel was already desperate 4 years ago, and I don't think that anybody on the board or any of their investors would have been happy to hear about a plan that slowly brought them back to health over the next 10 to 15 years. They wanted it fixed today, not tomorrow.
Are you saying that people like leaders who promise loads of bullshit up front?
Yeah, well, they like to elect the leader that promises all the bullshit tomorrow, and then they like to fire them the day after tomorrow when those impossible promises didn't get delivered. I'm not saying that I know for a fact that, Gelsinger is awesome and he didn't do anything wrong and he was better than the last guy. I don't really know. I don't know the guy at all personally, and I don't honestly know his reputation that well. But I do think that he never really had a shot, and I think that the endemic failures at Intel, I don't think it makes sense to hang them all on his head. I think that they can kick him out, but unfortunately, they're still going to be Intel after having fired him.
You say you don't know much about him, but he was an engineer. He's not like a business guy. I mean, I suppose he is now, but originally he was an engineer who actually understood some of the low-level stuff here.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of people, myself included, were, pretty excited at the news that he was going to helm the company. Intel had been helmed by the bean counters for a very long time. And, a lot of the reason they backslid so far was because of typical bean counter MBA kind of nonsense. Intel thrived because it could exercise and I have to be very careful here. We are now veering into legally protected personal opinion, not statement of fact, but Intel for a long time thrived on exploiting a near monopolistic condition and using anti-competitive practices to keep themselves on top rather than on constantly improving their technology to keep themselves on top. You didn't really see a whole lot of tangible effort from Intel to materially improve hardware until AMD suddenly started kicking their asses a few years ago. Then and only then, it suddenly became important for Intel processors to get a lot faster than they had been.
Yeah, but while they were battling it out with AMD, ARM came round the side and beat them both. Certainly when it comes to efficiency. Maybe not for like top-end performance, but it's all about ARM now. Look at what Apple has done with Apple Silicon. Look at what Microsoft are doing now with their Snapdragon-powered AI bullshit laptops.
Sure, and there's some other reasons for that. ARM isn't encumbered with as many decades of legacy cruft as x86 is. It's not that either AMD or Intel would be incapable of building faster processors with a different platform. It's that they are unfortunately saddled with needing to maintain, again, decades of cruft without which older versions of operating systems won't run, applications might not run reliably. There's a lot of nonsense they have to keep functional that's handicapping them in terms of competing with something like ARM or even RISC-V. Not that RISC-V is there yet, but you look further down the future, and this is all part of a fairly natural engineering cycle. You build something up, you perfect it, you get it the best it can possibly be, but then you have new needs, and you try to bolt those new needs onto this very fine-tuned, idealized platform, and eventually something has to give. One platform can't be everything to everybody, and that is a big disadvantage that both, like I said, Intel, AMD, anybody building x86-type processors is going to have to face. But that's orthogonal to the issue of them just not actually trying to materially advance in the first place until somebody made them. I think the most important part about what you said, Joe, is not so much about, and now ARM is kicking both of their asses. It just points out that even if AMD hadn't been the one to wake them up, it would have happened anyway a couple of years later with various ARM initiatives, even if it wasn't for, obviously Apple is leading the field there with their, M1, M2, et cetera. But even the Qualcomm stuff is widely disregarded as it is in the ARM space by comparison. it's gotten to the point where the higher end Qualcomm processors, they are competing pretty damn evenly in a lot of metrics with the much bigger x86 stuff, even despite the fact that, they're built to run in a smartphone without so much as a fan in it. So one way or another, this wake-up call was coming for Intel. And again, I don't think it's fair to hang that on Gelsinger's head. The man might not be perfect. For all I know, he might have done some really stupid things in the last 4 years. I don't know. But there's just no way you hang all this on his head and think that just by getting rid of him, Intel's going to right itself now.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried, to be honest, for Intel's future. I don't think it's going to be in the short term, but in the kind of medium to long term, I could see them just going away completely.
Well, this was a concern shared by big chunks of the US government. And they're like, well, do we get Qualcomm or AMD or Apple to buy Intel to make sure that there's still going to be an American fab where we can get chips sourced locally? Because if we learned anything, even just during the pandemic, is that supply chains have problems. We need the ability to make stuff locally sometimes.
What good would it do to get another American company that doesn't do its own fabbing to buy Intel to fix Intel's fabs that don't work? Because Apple's not fabbing the M1, it's going out to TSMC. So what you're really asking for is for TSMC to buy Intel because they're the ones with the fab experience. But now you're right back to your issue where, rah, America, bleed red, white, and blue. Well, now we're depending on a foreign company again.
A foreign company whose future is not certain with the China situation.
Well, to the point, part of the CHIPS Act, in addition to giving all this money to Intel, is also giving money to TSMC to open a fab on American soil. And the other headline we've seen recently is that as part of actually unlocking that funding from the CHIPS Act, Intel is going to have some covenants on that, where that if they do spin off their fab business into a separate company, that Intel has to maintain a majority stake in it, and that no other company can control more than 35% of it, including via owning Intel stock, to prevent the money from the CHIPS Act being able to be controlled by, again, a foreign company.
The difficulties, they just keep expanding from there because, again, at the heart of it, the issue is that we don't have a way to fab chips on American soil with all American infrastructure, and that's really important to the American government and to a lot of the particularly patriotic rah-rah businesses that think that's a huge win. Well, one of the things that's been done to sort of kind of address that is, getting TSMC itself to open up fabs on American soil. But you're still talking about a non-American company. What makes it even worse, TMC's third fab in Arizona back in 2023, its opening got delayed. It was projected then to not be open until 2025. And the reason for that is because United States talent to operate the thing was insufficient. So you're not only talking about trying to get a fab on American soil. If you're really wanting to do the bleed red, white, and blue stuff you're talking about, you need to be running it with native-born American leadership and folks on the floor and everything. And the folks who are the actual experts in this are complaining we can't find enough Americans that know what they're doing. So there's a lot we need to fix if we want to maintain this idea that all of our critical hardware is going to be nothing but, made in the USA from scratch, no foreign, blah, blah, blah. We're fighting the entire trend of the human economy for the last few decades, which is to have a global economy where you have specialized things in different places and you have mutually beneficial trades back and forth.
And you have a stable world order that allows that to happen.
An old free software style hippie like myself might point out that it's kind of like asking proprietary software to compete with open source software on an equal basis. There are some hurdles you got to jump. The talent pool is bigger.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by ServerMania. Go to servermania.com/25A to get 15% off dedicated servers recurring for life. ServerMania is a Canadian company with over a decade of experience building high-performance infrastructure hosting platforms for businesses globally. ServerMania has up to 20 gigabits per second network speeds in 8 locations worldwide for optimized global reach. They have flexible custom server configurations tailored to unique needs, as well as a personal account manager offering free consultations. With 24/7 live chat support and support ticket response times under 15 minutes, you can always keep your systems running smoothly. Alan's been a happy ServerMania customer for over 7 years, so support the show and join him at a hosting provider that truly delivers. Get 15% off dedicated servers recurring for life at servermania.com/25A and use code 25admins. That's servermania.com/25A and code 25admins. Zipcar outage strands customers in random places. Who knew that opening a car with an app that required a remote server could go wrong and cause people to get locked out of it?
You know who knew that, Joe? Meta knew that. Remember when nobody could get into the Meta offices for a day?
Yeah.
Yes, when they broke their routers, and so their keycard access to get into the data center to reset the router didn't work.
It's funny, but there actually are a lot of parallels there, because in the case of that earlier Facebook outage where they found out they couldn't even get into their own buildings because they had a dependency on their data center being up to get into their data center, we're still talking about an issue where, you've got this remote electronic unlock that requires access to a cloud backend. And if things are broken in the cloud, well, now you no longer have access to your local stuff either. And I think the bigger part of this story, honestly, is not so much, a company with a cloud backend screwed up and the cloud backend was inaccessible for a while. For me, the bigger part of the story was how badly Zipcar has been reported to have handled it.
Yeah. So to provide a bit of context to people, Zipcar is an app that lets you basically rent a car by the hour. So the cars are parked in parking garages or specific parking spots. And if you need a car to, say, go get groceries or move some furniture or something, you go on the app, you book the car, and then you can just walk up to the car and use the app to unlock the car and get in it and do what you got to do. But when the outage happened, it meant that in one of the examples in the story, somebody pulled over, went into the store to buy a drink, came back, and they couldn't unlock the car to get back in it. The other big problem, especially from a safety aspect, is it seems some people were also unable to lock the car when they got out because you need the app to do that, and the app was down. So now you can't leave valuables in the car because the car can't be locked.
And Zipcar was threatening people that if the car was stolen because they couldn't lock it because Zipcar's network was down, that they would be responsible for the car being stolen. Which brings me back to, me being like, to me, the bigger part of the story was not company with cloud backend screws up and their stuff is inaccessible for a while. It was the business response. I don't really find it unforgivable that Zipcar had an outage that caused these major problems, even with the serious problems it caused some people. There were some users that were stranded hundreds of miles away from their house in really bad weather outside a locked car, and it was really bad. But again, outages happen. The thing that really bothered me was all the stories of people being told that Zipcar was holding them personally responsible for securing a vehicle that couldn't be locked, was charging them incredible late fees for cars that Zipcar did not mark as turned in because the app wasn't working when people clicked the button that said, I'm done with this car. There were a million different things that went wrong, and Zipcar appeared to be trying very hard to blame every last bit of it on its users and collect every last dollar from them that it could. And that's not how you respond when you screw up your own infrastructure and cause problems for your customers. You take care of your customers. Are you listening, Zipcar?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing this highlighted is that they didn't seem to have a contingency plan for when their cloud went out. They didn't have procedures in place. And what do we do about people who would try to return their car and can't because the app was down and all these things? They really didn't seem to have a plan for how to deal with this. And then when they did try to deal with it, they did it really, really badly.
And this shouldn't have been difficult to game out as a possible scenario that you needed to plan for, even above and beyond the meta comparison that I already made. If you look at vehicles specifically and issues with cloud-based lock, unlock, and activation, this was an issue that has hit companies before Zipcar was a thing, to the best of my knowledge. Tesla has had several short outages where their cloud backend was inaccessible for some reason. And, for like a day or two at a time, people who normally have their Teslas automatically unlock when they get within range because of their phone's Bluetooth connecting to the car, that stopped working for a while. But here's me saying something nice about Tesla for once. That was actually less of a problem because although a lot of people hadn't paid attention to that, Tesla gives you a key card that works for the car. And if the remote unlock with your phone stops working, you can still hold the card to the A-pillar of the door and it unlocks. And that never stopped working because that never required the cloud backend to begin with. It all happened locally and you could still get in your car and drive it away. Zipcar didn't make any similar provisions here.
Yeah, it's about failure modes, isn't it? It's about how do you deal with the failure of the main way you interact with technology? You've got to have fail-safes.
Precisely. You need to fail gracefully because you're going to fail.
Well, and in particular, to Joe's comment, it's just the word, but fail safe. You want the car to fail to a safe condition. It's probably better to fail to an unlocked state than a locked state because you don't want to lock somebody in the car or lock something valuable in the car that people can't access. What if somebody's kid was in the backseat of the car and then the car is locked and you can't unlock the car?
Well, that's what God made crowbars for.
Yeah. But really, the other thing is they didn't seem to have a lot of segregation between kind of important stuff and marketing stuff, right? They say that as part of a Black Friday promotion, they had increased traffic to their website, and that was part of the cause of the issue. And they don't actually say specifically where they say Black Friday promotion caused SMS delivery service constraints, but it seems like they hit the rate limit on how many SMSs they could send per minute or per hour or whatever. And the fact that they used the same quota of SMS messages for Black Friday promotional stuff, trying to text people and get them to take a deal, as to actually unlock a car or do two-factor authentication during login, meant that people couldn't log in because they had spent too much of their quota spamming people with coupon codes. Maybe don't use the same quota of SMS messages.
Not quite the same thing, but kind of reminiscent of when I see companies decide, we don't need to pay MailChimp or anybody else for our bulk email delivery. We'll just have the secretary send, a big 5,000 BCC message out of our Outlook and it'll be fine.
Yeah, and it could be that, again, the way they worded it, it wasn't actually them that ran into a limit. It was that the SMS service provider they were using had oversold how many SMS messages they could actually deliver. And when everybody was trying to send Black Friday messages, the mobile carrier networks were limiting them or something. But either way, they really need to separate the marketing activities from the critical login path. And probably the same thing goes for their API. Every visitor to your website shouldn't be using up resources that stop people from unlocking your car.
Also, God forbid, but maybe we stop trying to build infrastructure based on SMS messaging. Stop it. Stop.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Kermit has done. He writes, I need to migrate a company's email because it does not have DMARC. I'm thinking Proton Mail to make it easy, and the users get a bit of extra perks like the password manager to help them with not reusing passwords. I've also thought about just hosting it. I know this varies widely case by case. However, what options do you gents recommend?
Yeah, I think in general, hosting yourself has a lot of drawbacks, especially around deliverability. And the biggest thing with email is that when you email a customer, you want to be damn sure that the email gets to their inbox and doesn't get dropped on the floor as spam. So sadly, the way the internet has become, you kind of have to be coming from a relatively big network in order to accomplish that. So going with a larger trusted hosting provider is probably your only real option.
Plus, it requires constant tweaking. And, if this is your baby, do you have the personal bandwidth available to constantly tweak it when things need changes to ensure continued deliverability? If not, you might want to use a company who does, in fact, have people that they employ to do exactly that.
Yeah, I've mentioned before, sometimes when you do have a requirement to self-host at least part of it, whether it's for a certain application or something, there are ways to kind of have a hybrid approach. For example, if you're using Microsoft's Office 365 hosted thing, you can set up an authorized relay where your server inside your network is allowed to send mail to Microsoft, who will then send it on to the ultimate destination so that all the mail comes from Microsoft and gets through the spam filters, but still originated from your real postfix server or whatever. And options like that can cover the cases where it maybe doesn't make sense to just directly use one of these larger providers. But like Jim said, unless you're going to basically commit yourself every day to fighting with email, it's really the best option. And who really wants to spend that much of their time on email?
So do we think Proton Mail is a reasonable choice?
Yeah, I think Proton Mail and Fast Mail are both great choices here. Those are my two go-to companies to recommend when somebody says, look, I want somebody to host my email for me and I don't want it to be either Microsoft or Google. Those are my two top choices. I did want to double check and make sure that both natively support setting up your own DKIM records because while DMARC itself, you don't need any cooperation from your mail host. As long as you've got control of your own DNS, you can set up a DMARC record and set your DMARC policy. Nothing else required. However, that's not really useful if you don't have proper DKIM going on, and that requires integration with the mail server configuration. However, both Proton and Fastmail definitely support customer configured DKIM, so yeah, either will be a great choice.
Colin, who's a patron, also skipped the queue. He writes, I'm a data scientist and Python developer by day, amateur sysadmin by night, and have failed repeatedly to figure out ZFS and how to set up TrueNAS Scale for a simple NFS share in my home lab on my local network. Do you think the new HexOS project is worth paying for? Its value proposition is simplification of TrueNAS.
HexOS is designed to kind of take away a lot of the confusing settings and options from TrueNAS Scale and bring it down to a much simpler set of use cases. So it's very much about just a core set of use cases, right? If you're not doing one of the 5 or 6 things that HexOS is targeting, then they, on purpose, are really not for you, right? They really want to be very good at a couple of specific things to avoid the problem that TrueNAS has of trying to be all things to all people and being too confusing and having too many options. So as a developer and amateur sysadmin, if you're going to want to maybe do more with this in the future and have a bit more control, you're probably better off staying with the plain TrueNAS. But if you are doing just one of the use cases that HexOS highlights, then it can remove a lot of that complexity for you.
Alternate answer, I would suggest considering another NAS distribution other than TrueNAS Scale. TrueNAS Scale is probably the most complicated thing out there to try to get set up and fiddle with. It's a lot newer than regular TrueNAS. I see a lot of people wanting to go with TrueNAS Scale just because it's Linux and they get scared of FreeBSD. But honestly, that doesn't really have any bearing on a realistic choice between TrueNAS Core and TrueNAS Scale. The only reason I know of that you would really want TrueNAS Scale is if you want native Docker support. If you want that, you need Linux, so you want Scale. But I don't hear anything about Docker, which says to me that you have the option of A, trying vanilla TrueNAS, which also is not really my recommendation. I'm going to hammer on a very frequent recommendation of mine, which is if you find TrueNAS too complicated, try ZigmaNAS. ZigmaNAS and TrueNAS are both forks of the original FreeNAS project, which was based on the old monowall FreeBSD-based firewall interface way back in the day. And the big difference is that ZigmaNAS, which originally was named NAS for free, that wasn't confusing next to FreeNAS at all, it's based on the original code, whereas when IX bought the rights to the project and its branding, they essentially chucked most of it to the bin, and it's kind of an entirely new and different project. In practice, I find that ZigmaNAS is a lot simpler and more intuitive to get through its interface. It doesn't look as shiny and as fancy by any means. It still looks like it's forked from an old, monowall project from the early 2000s. However, it just works, and it's a lot easier to just sit down, not already being an expert in it, and figure out what you need to do, in my experience, in my opinion. And I would probably start off with that before I forked over a few $100 for a lifetime license to a project that isn't actually out yet, personally.
Can I just put in a vote for Ubuntu server and setting it up manually without any sort of web interface? Just do it all via SSH.
If all you need is an NFS share, then that's pretty straightforward, yeah.
Yeah, I managed it, and I'm not even a proper admin. I'm not even a half admin, according to a lot of listeners.
Yeah, you can absolutely put in that vote. And I mean, I'll second that vote. I try really hard not to tell everybody they have to do things like the exact way I would and like command line everything and the absolute bare minimum of whatever. I think there are happy mediums to be found. It does seem likely that somebody who's specifically asking about NAS distributions is probably looking for a NAS distribution and a GUI. And if that is important to you, it's something that like you really need, then again, my next recommendation would be give ZigmaNAS a shot and see if that works for you. If it doesn't, then yeah, just try vanilla Ubuntu and see what it looks like getting it set up. If our 0.1 admin can manage it, you probably can too.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joeres.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.